Hi guys, and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. Great to have you here again. I've had another week of reading about the R7, watching more videos, finding out about a few more things, and also reading your hundreds and hundreds of comments that you left on my last video about the R7. If you guys haven't watched that video, make sure to check that out. So now, after a week of getting more information, seeing some files, I'll definitely have some more information that I want to share with you, and we're going to do that right now. Last week I said the R7 is an amazing camera with industry-leading autofocus, similar to the R3, unheard of in this kind of price range, so that's amazing. It has fantastic video capabilities with no recording limit, and it has great speed at 15 frames per second mechanical. Only the 1DX Mark III actually has a faster mechanical shutter with 16 frames per second, and it shoots up to 30 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode, so that's amazing. But there were obviously a few drawbacks as well that I mentioned, like likely having a bit of rolling shutter, a bit of noise on that sensor with the 32 megapixels on that small APS-C sensor, a relatively small overall buffer size, especially in the electronic shutter mode at 30 frames per second. You only have a few seconds you can shoot, and it also has a relatively average kind of very basic EVF with a relatively low resolution. And all of that is wrapped up in a body with a completely new design that we will have to decide in the field whether we like it or not, but at the first glance it definitely seems a little bit odd. The great thing about it though is that it comes in at a great price of just $14.99 US, so when it comes to the price we really can't complain about that camera. When it comes to the buffer, there's certainly some ways to deal with it, like you could lower your frame rate and then you can shoot for longer, or you can probably shoot over 10 seconds with the mechanical shutter at 15 frames per second. Which is great, but when I personally really need the buffer is when there's high action, peak action, and that kind of action I would usually like to shoot at the fastest frame rate, which would be 30 frames per second on that camera. So I will definitely run into issues with the buffer on that camera, but for normal usage it's probably large enough. When I read about the R7 initially, I was a little bit disappointed because of the name and my own expectations. Whenever we talked about an R7 in the past, we imagined it to be like a mirrorless successor of the 7D Mark II, like a mirrorless 7D Mark III. A great semi-professional camera and a good body, like an R6 body for instance, with good speed, good autofocus, and an all-around very well-made camera that can be a great second body to like an R5 for instance, like how many people had a 5D and a 7D as their main two cameras. I think many people would have actually been happy with a slightly higher price if they could have had all those specs. But of course, we can't always get what we want. So instead we got a successor to the 80D and the 90D with some amazing features and some head scratches. It actually seems to me that Canon actively tries to discourage people who currently own an R5 or an R6 to also buy an R7 because they changed all the controls, make it a lot harder to jump quickly between the two cameras. They made the EVF worse even than the one on the R6, and they're not offering a battery grip at all for the R7. So with all this information, let's look at the R7 with some fresh eyes. Not offering a battery grip and having controls that lend themselves a lot more to like a program P mode kind of shooting with like auto ISO or AV with auto ISO actually might tell us a lot about Canon and the intended user for this camera. I don't mean that in a like degrading way, but it seems like the Canon does not expect their users to actually shoot a lot of manual mode like I do a lot, and that's why I complain about the three wheels. If you've never used manual mode and you shoot auto ISO, you don't really have the use for the three wheels. And that got me thinking, so maybe having that wheel up there will actually please a lot of people that never use the three buttons anyways, and maybe they even find the camera easier to use if it has less buttons. Not having a battery grip also actually makes sense once we look at it from our new perspective and the actual market segment it's targeted at. Because in this segment, I think people look at the price, the weight, and the size of the camera. And the R7 does very well in all these three categories. It's not super expensive, it's pretty light, and not very big. So most people probably would not want to shell out another $300–400 for battery grip to make the camera bigger and a lot more expensive. So from that angle, I can actually see why Canon thinks they wouldn't be selling that many battery grips anyways, and then thought, let's screw it, let's save the chips, let's just not make any battery grips for those two cameras. So as an 80D or 90D successor, or like an entry-level camera into the mirrorless market, this R7 camera actually makes a lot of sense to me. Where I got the most confused is actually the name, because the name suggested something to us that the camera was never intended to be, and that's where a lot of my own personal disappointment and confusion arose from at the start as well. I'm sure basically anyone who's currently using a DSLR will find the R7 to be quite a substantial upgrade, especially when it comes to the autofocusing. I've definitely ordered one for myself, and I'm looking forward to using it in the field and sharing my thoughts and experiences and files with you once I finally get the camera and get to take it out. I expect it to be very good in certain areas and a bit limited in other areas. Where I think it will be great is, for instance, with those f11 lenses, because the focusing area will be a little bit larger because the sensor is smaller. The camera will have fantastic speed, up to 30 frames per second. That's awesome, and great video capability. So I'm really looking forward to using that camera, and I think in its market segment and at this price point, it's a real standout. And of course, we also can't forget the 1.6 crop factor. With small animals and small birds, that can definitely be helpful because the bird will be bigger in your viewfinder, you have to do less cropping, and you get more pixels on the bird. So that should be very helpful for many of you, and like 100 to 500 suddenly becomes 160 to 800 millimeter lens, or the 800 millimeter lens becomes like a 1280 millimeter lens. So you'll have some nice lightweight combos that you can actually walk around with that have some amazing long focal length. Jared Polin, or better known as the Fro, has also been able to give us a few RAW files this week, or I should say converted RAW files into DNG files, and we were all able to download them and open them up in Lightroom and Camera Raw. I'll link it for you down there in the description. And looking at those images, there's a lot of noise in them. First of all, that's not super surprising when you're using Adobe, because they've been really struggling with noise in all Canon files. And that's, for instance, why I've been using DX or Pure RAW, typically before running my images through Camera Raw to get rid of that noise. However, for instance, the soccer player in low light at ISO 4000, even with a little bit of noise reduction on it, still looks pretty noisy. So high ISO will definitely be a challenge for this camera. The files will be usable, but I get the feeling that you want to have a good noise reduction workflow and good noise reduction software to actually be able to have a lot of fun with that camera. Talking about RAW files, if you want to learn how to make your RAW images stand out and look absolutely amazing, I would highly recommend that you check out my PROSETS and Masterclass down there in the description, where I teach you step by step how to make your own images look fantastic. And with my PROSETS, I give you with just one click the ability to transform your RAW file from a flat RAW file into a great starting point for your editing process. It definitely seems like it's the week of the APS-C sensor, because Sony has released some vlogging lenses and Fuji has released some more lenses and its new APS-C flagship camera, the X-H2S. It comes with a 26 megapixel stacked BSI sensor. It shoots up to 40 frames per second. That's pretty awesome, but apparently the accuracy at 40 frames per second is not that good, and you might only get about 200 images in your buffer. But if you slow it down to 20 frames per second, you get up to 1,000 images in your buffer, raw images that is, and the tracking also seems to be a little bit more accurate. So that's pretty good stats. I hope you're listening there, Canon. We definitely want to see bigger buffers from you. It also has AI autofocus, so it has some bird tracking, animal tracking, human tracking. Pretty cool. That was only one of the areas where the reviewers kind of still seem to be a little bit concerned, but it definitely seemed to work pretty well overall. And it also comes with fantastic video features like 6K at 30 frames per second, 4K at 120 frames per second, and Full HD at 240 frames per second. So overall, some pretty impressive specs. It also comes with the battery grip, listening Canon, and it also comes with a little cooling fan, listening there again, Canon. So there will likely be some sort of overheating issues, but they already bring it with the fix to you, so that should be pretty good, and hopefully it can record for a long time without overheating. All around, quite an impressive sounding little APS-C camera, and it has a few things people really wanted to see in an R7 but didn't get, like an stacked BSI sensor for faster readout, so there's no rolling shutter and very little blackout. Interestingly and quite amusingly to me, it seemed like the feedback was quite mixed on the camera, and one of the main drawbacks was the price. People said it's too expensive. So we have a full spec camera that's quite expensive, and then we have an R7 that's a bit lower spec and cheaper. And people with the R7 say maybe they would have liked to spend more, have better specs. And maybe Fuji people are now saying they would have liked to have a few less specs and a better price point. So I think what teaches that to us? In the end, we can never be pleased. Fuji also announced a 150 to 600mm lens, going from f5.6 at 100mm to f8 at 600mm. Looks like a nice and small lens at 1.6 kilo or 3.5 pounds, so not super lightweight, but definitely handholdable, and at a price of about $2,000. So all in all, with that new X-H2S camera, I think that could be a very interesting birding camera for many that want to look beyond that sort of Sony, Canon and Nikon areas. Even though the R7 costs a lot less than the Fuji X-H2S, I would expect the R7 autofocus to work significantly better than the Fuji autofocus, because in all the reviews I've watched, the autofocus was one of the areas that people question, and I would expect some stellar performance from the R7 when it comes to the autofocusing, just going off what I've been using on the R5, the R6 and the R3. A lot of you guys have been asking me, what about your R3 review and then R3 versus R5 video? That's definitely coming. I just had a lot of other things on my plate, like that BirdLife conference. I've fallen a little bit behind with filming, but I'll try to catch up and give you that video very soon. And on that note, I think it's a great time to wrap up this week's Early Bird Photo News. Like always, please give me a thumbs up for this video and let me know in the comments all your thoughts about the R7, the Fuji X-H2S, the new lenses, and anything else you want to contribute, or if you want to hear something specific about the R3 or R3 versus R5 in my review, also make sure to put that in the comments. Other than that, please subscribe to the channel, check out my masterclass and PROSETS also down there in the description, and I will see you guys in my next video very soon. Bye!